In the space of a year, Jordan Peterson went from being a little-known psychology professor at Toronto University to a YouTube sensation with almost 1 million subscribers. His fame, or infamy if you prefer, stems from his rage against political correctness. But Jordan Peterson's also a serious scholar of the Bible, and its stories form the backdrop for much of his recent book, 12 Rules for Life, an antidote to chaos. After Easter, we'll bring you an extended interview with Jordan, but for now, I think you'll find his take on the struggle between good and evil to be quite compelling.
People turn to tribal identity when they can't find an identity that's more satisfying than that. It's a default position to identify with your tribe. We see the consequence of nihilism in the universities of today. I think the universities have no shortage of sins on their conscience, let's say. They teach postmodern, neo-Marxist ideology in the place of profound education to young people and warp and bend them and distort the entire social fabric. That's a big problem.
Your critique of the universities is not that they teach about Marxism, it's what, that they teach a political... Yeah, rather than questioners.
Exactly. The conclusion is already put in place. The West is a corrupt patriarchy, dominated by men for the purposes of men, perhaps dominated by white men for the purposes of white men. It's a view of the world that puts group identity in the paramount position. And I think the evidence that that is overwhelmingly dangerous is incontrovertible. Nonetheless, that's what the universities do. And I mean, the real activist disciplines like women's studies, for example, they make no secret of this. They're out to produce activists, and the activists are aimed at the reconstruction, deconstruction, demolition, and replacement of the corrupt Western patriarchy.
So I'm hoping that you think the correct model is one that asks us to question.
Well, I mean, if your life is everything you think it could be, then you don't need to question. But I have yet to meet someone who's in that fortunate position. And if you think that your ignorance might be contributing to your unnecessary suffering, then, of course, you should open up your eyes and your ears, and you might find yourself fortunate enough to learn something of value. Anyone with any sense has a continually questioning attitude, not least about what they themselves believe, because there's so much that you don't know compared to what you do know, and maybe some of it will help you.
Jordan, does all of this go back to the story of Adam and Eve and their fall in the Garden of Eden? Because you clearly love that story, because it is a recurring theme in your book.
It's an amazing story. You never get to the bottom of that story. It's a story of the coming to self-consciousness of the human race. We woke up and we realized that we died. We realized that we were mortal. The scales fell from our eyes and we saw our own death. And that produced a cataclysmic break in the structure of reality. At the same time, we became aware of evil. Once you realize that you're vulnerable, this is what differentiates human beings from animals. Once you know that you can be hurt, then you know how to hurt other people, and you can make it into an art form. And it's in that manner that evil enters the world, is with the conscious understanding of how to manipulate the vulnerabilities of other people and yourselves, and then to take advantage of that. That's just where it starts, but that's a good beginning.
Yeah, well, the other biblical motive that you draw on, it is very powerful, and that's the story of Cain and Abel. Why do you think this story echoes down the millennia?
Well, I think partly because it's such a horrifying story. It's very short, right? It's less than a paragraph long.
Yeah.
But Cain and Abel both make sacrifices to God in order to order their lives and to thrive. And it works for Abel, but it doesn't work for Cain. The story isn't exactly clear why, but it seems plausible. Cain's sacrifices are not everything they could be. In any case, his sacrifices are rejected by God. Abel thrives, everyone loves him, but Cain plays second fiddle constantly, and it makes him terribly bitter. And he takes his case up before God, and he says something like, how dare you construct a reality where I work myself to the bone for nothing, while my favored brother has nothing but benefits as a consequence. And God essentially says, look to your own devices before you criticize the structure of the world. I place the sin at your feet, not at mine. And that enrages Cain to the degree that he kills Abel. And that's the first story about human beings in our foundational narrative, because Adam and Eve were made by God. They're not real human beings in some sense.
So where do we see the Cain and Abel parable being lived out again and again today?
Oh, you see it with the school shooters in the United States. They're all possessed by the spirit of Cain. They're all resentful and bitter because their sacrifices have gone unrewarded. They all desire to destroy the ideal and to take revenge against God.
Do we see it in religious extremists of all faiths? We surely see it in Islamic State.
I think it's more complicated because people there are also possessed by the spirit of group identification. So you have an interplay there between group identification and the desire to destroy. Whereas with the school shooters, it's more purely the desire for revenge against being. So it isn't as though the school shooter types are simultaneously stating, here's an ethos that we put forward. Whereas the ISIS people at least purport to be religious fundamentalists, right? They have an ethos that goes along with their murderousness.
The other source that you cite often is the great Russian dissident writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He wrote, I remember from high school, A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. And he said something to the effect of that the line that divides good and evil cuts through the heart of every being. This is very scary. It's very compelling. Can I ask you, as an experienced psychologist, does this mean that we're all capable of being Mahatma Gandhi and a concentration camp guard at Auschwitz-Birkenau?
More likely the latter than the former.
Yeah.
It's easier to descend than to ascend, and people are capable of horrors that they can barely imagine.
Yeah, well, I think you made the point that, look, we're more intelligent than animals, not more sentient, but we're more intelligent, but we're also the only species that inflicts suffering for the sake of suffering.
Yeah, that's the critical distinction right there, is that we can and will inflict suffering for the vengeful joy of that. Now, when you look at Sandy Hook, for example, where one of the school shooters killed elementary school kids, you think, well, what drives someone to do that? It's like, well, if you're going to punish and hurt, you hurt the innocent, not the guilty, right? Because that's more punishing and more hurtful. It's more evil. So it's necessary for people to constrain that capacity within themselves. And it's far more present within people than they really generally are willing to see or admit.
So, Jordan, is the antidote to that a strong sense of guilt? Because if you say today to people that a bit of guilt is a good thing, you know, the whole psychology profession, the whole wellness industry will come down on you like a ton of bricks. How dare you make people feel guilty about anything? But is a sense of guilt then the antidote to that temptation to human deprivation?
Well, it's at least a start. I mean, the last thing you ever want to meet is someone who doesn't have the capacity to feel guilt. There's not much difference between that and psychopathy. Now, you know, people do feel unwarranted guilt, I would say, but I would think about it more in terms of responsibility than guilt, though. Responsibility, in some sense, I suppose, is the guilt that you take on voluntarily. You're responsible for straightening out your life. It isn't clear that you're responsible for your capability, for the capability that you have for good or for evil. That's part of your nature in some sense. But you do have the responsibility to minimize the one and maximize the other. And the sense of guilt when you make a moral error is an unbelievably helpful guide. It can go out of control, just like anxiety can. Any emotion can dominate to the point where it becomes pathological, but beware the man who is incapable of feeling guilt. That's not someone that you want to.
So we should carry around with us a bit of latent guilt as a check on what we might do?
Oh yeah, that would be good. Well, I suppose that's part of the wisdom of the idea of original sin. We're fallen creatures. We're striving upward, but damaged in our current condition. I also think everyone understands that. You rarely meet a person who's entirely satisfied with their own mode of being. I mean, the only people you ever see who aren't like that are narcissistic. And then that's shallow generally. You don't have to scratch very far until you find the insecurity underneath narcissism. That's
psychologist Jordan Peterson. And in a coming program, you'll hear a longer discussion with Jordan about these themes. And you're with me, Andrew West.